About 10 years ago, a mysterious new neighbor moved into the house across from ours in my old neighborhood. Her name was Mrs. Green, a woman in her mid-40s who seemed to appear out of nowhere. She lived alone, and from the very beginning, there was something odd about her. While she was polite and always smiled if greeted, there was a distance in her demeanor that felt unsettling. Mrs. Green rarely ventured outside, and when she did, it was only for brief walks or to collect her mail. Though she looked friendly on the surface, her behavior always left me with an eerie feeling. My friends and I would often play in our front yard, running around and laughing, while Mrs. Green would sit on her patio, watching us, not casually, but intensely for hours without bothering to hide it. Sometimes, I'd glance over and catch her staring at us with a blank, almost hollow expression. If she wasn't on the patio, she'd peek through her curtains, as if always keeping an eye on us, even when we were inside. It was unnerving. One autumn night, I was sitting with my parents in the den, watching TV when suddenly, the lights outside flickered on. Through the window, we saw a shadow, a figure moving, though their face was obscured by darkness. My dad got up to check, but by the time he reached the front door, the figure had vanished. He looked around and saw nothing out of place. We shrugged it off, thinking it was just a trick of the light or some passerby. The next morning, as my dad left for work, he noticed something strange. The solar-powered lights lining our driveway were missing. The ground where they once stood was disturbed, the soil freshly overturned. As he backed out of the driveway, he glanced over at Mrs. Green's yard, and to his surprise, there were all 5 of our solar lights, perfectly arranged in a row, just as they had been in our yard. He called my mom and me outside to see. We rubbed our eyes, still half asleep, and sure enough, the lights were there. Mrs. Green was in her garden, watering her flowers, acting as though nothing was amiss. We exchanged confused glances, but none of us said anything. We weren't the type to confront neighbors, and honestly, the lights were cheap and not worth the hassle. Mrs. Green waved at us cheerfully, as she always did, smiling as if the lights had been hers all along. After that, we started noticing other bizarre things. Every year, our Christmas and Halloween decorations would mysteriously get damaged or disappear, though no one else on our street had the same issue. One Halloween, the pumpkins we had carefully carved the night before were gone by morning. We stopped decorating altogether, figuring it wasn't worth the trouble. More strangely, Mrs. Green seemed to mimic everything we did. If we planted new flowers, she'd plant the exact same ones in her yard the next day. If we bought a garden gnome, a similar one would appear on her lawn soon after. When my mom wore her sun hat, Mrs. Green would step out wearing one just like it. If we were outside raking leaves, she'd come out with her own rake and start clearing her yard at the same time. Despite all these odd behaviors, we never confronted her. She didn't seem dangerous, just strange. Over the years, there were many other incidents, but they became almost normal to us, part of the strange rhythm of living near Mrs. Green. Eventually, we moved out of that neighborhood. Now, our new neighbors are friendly and normal, thankfully, but every once in a while, I wonder about Mrs. Green and her peculiar ways, and what she might be up to in that old house.
It was a quiet evening about 4 years ago. I was living alone with my son in a small house just outside of town. It was one of those places where you could enjoy some peace and quiet, but at the same time, it wasn't too far from the main part of the town. You couldn't just walk there, but it was a quick drive. I had a few neighbors. Nice enough people, though we mostly kept to ourselves. It wasn't the kind of neighborhood where people dropped by unannounced or anything. It was just a calm, simple life. That night, my son was already in bed. It was late, probably around 11 p.m., and I was doing what any mom would do after a long day, cleaning up the kitchen, washing dishes, and mentally preparing myself for bed. My dog, Goldie, was outside. She loved the big open field next to our house. She'd run and play, sniff around, and just enjoy the freedom. Goldie was my loyal companion, always nearby, and usually I didn't worry too much about her when she was out there. It was her routine, after all. As I scrubbed away at the dishes, humming along to some music playing in the background, something caught my attention. I glanced out the window, expecting to see nothing but the field, but instead, I noticed a light. It was faint, small, but definitely a light, like someone was out there with a flashlight. My first thought was maybe a neighbor was out for a walk or lost something, but then I realized that this light was far too close to my property. I tried to brush it off, but that uneasy feeling started to creep in. I decided it was time to call Goldie back. I opened the back door, stepped out onto the porch, and called her name. She's usually pretty quick to come running when I call, but that night she didn't. I called again. Still nothing. Now I was starting to get worried. I looked out into the field, squinting in the dark, trying to see her. And that's when I heard it. A voice. A man's voice. Someone else was out there, and they were calling my dog. I froze. The voice came from the direction of that light. It wasn't a voice I recognized. And Goldie, my sweet dog, was standing in the field, halfway between me and that stranger's voice. She was confused, looking back and forth between me and the man. My heart was pounding in my chest. I knew something wasn't right, and I couldn't risk letting her go to whoever was out there. I called her again, louder this time, and thank God she listened. She hesitated for a second, but then sprinted toward me. As soon as she reached the porch, I grabbed her, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I turned off all the lights inside the house, trying to stay calm, but also ready for anything. My hands were shaking. I could still see that light out in the field, but it wasn't moving toward the house, at least not yet. I grabbed the only thing I had for protection, a baseball bat I kept in the laundry room. It wasn't much, but it was something. With Goldie at my feet, I walked around the house, checking all the windows and doors, making sure everything was locked. I could feel my heart racing, but I kept telling myself to stay calm, to stay focused. After securing the house, I cautiously peeked out the window. The light was gone. I breathed a little easier, but I knew I wasn't out of the woods yet. I decided to leave a small light on in the kitchen and tried to finish washing the dishes. I kept the bat closed, though, just in case. Time passed. 20, maybe 30 minutes. I was just starting to relax when I heard it. A loud crash from the garage. My heart nearly stopped. Something, or someone, was in the garage. I was alone in the house with my son, and my mind was racing. I knew I couldn't handle this alone, so I called my neighbor across the street. Thankfully, he answered. I told him what was happening, my voice shaking, and asked if he could look out his window to see if anyone was near my garage. He agreed, but I could tell he was just as worried as I was. While I waited, I made my way to the laundry room where I could control the garage door from the inside. I figured if I turned the lights on, it might scare the intruder off. But as soon as I hit the button, my neighbor shouted into the phone. "There's someone in your garage." Panic washed over me. My neighbor's voice was full of fear, and I knew I had to act quickly. I gripped the bat tighter and slowly opened the door to the garage, ready to defend myself if it came to that. What I saw was both terrifying and ridiculous. There was a man crouched awkwardly by the side of my car, trying and failing to hide. I took a deep breath and stepped closer, my bat raised. "I know you're there," I said as calmly as I could, though my voice was shaking. "This is private property, and you're trespassing. If you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police." The man didn't even seem fazed. He stood up, dusted himself off, and started walking toward the garage door like nothing had happened. As he passed me, he smiled and said, "Sorry to disturb you. Just checking things out." I didn't say anything. I just stood there, bat in hand, watching as he casually walked out of my garage like he hadn't just broken in. As soon as he was gone, I shut the door and locked it. My heart was still racing, but I quickly checked the garage to see if anything was missing. Nothing. It looked like he hadn't taken anything. The loud crash I'd heard was from him knocking over a toolbox, but it seemed like his clumsiness had gotten him caught before he could steal anything. Still shaken, I called the police and reported the break-in. When they arrived, they took my statement and looked around the property. The man had managed to pry open a small window in the garage and squeeze through. It was slightly broken, but thankfully, he hadn't gotten any further into the house. The police assured me they'd patrol the area, but for the next few days, I couldn't shake the fear that he might come back. Every time I heard a noise, my heart would race, and I'd double-check all the doors and windows. It wasn't until a few days later that I heard about a man being arrested for breaking into homes in a nearby neighborhood, doing exactly what had happened to me. I never found out for sure if it was the same guy, but after that night, I was much more careful. I added more locks to the doors, installed security cameras, and made sure Goldie was never outside without me. That night was one of the scariest experiences of my life, but it taught me to always trust my instincts and be prepared. If anything like this ever happens to you, don't hesitate to call for help, and don't be afraid to protect yourself. Thanks for listening to my story, and if you've ever experienced something like this, let me know in the comments. Stay safe, everyone.
This is something I've been hesitant to share for a while, but now I feel like I need to get it off my chest. It happened about a year ago, and I've replayed the events in my mind more times than I can count, but I still don't have any answers. The more I think about it, the stranger it gets. So, bear with me as I try to explain exactly what happened. It all started one regular weekday morning, or at least I thought it was regular. I was staying at home, working remotely due to the whole work-from-home trend, which meant I had the luxury of waking up a little later than usual. My wife, Emily, and our two kids, Sam and Lily, were usually up and out of the house by the time I got out of bed, which wasn't unusual. They had their own routines. Emily would take the kids to school, run some errands, and sometimes come back before lunch. That morning, though, I felt off from the second I woke up. I couldn't quite put my finger on why, but it was one of those moments where you just feel like something isn't right. I shrugged it off as waking up on the wrong side of the bed and headed downstairs, expecting the house to be empty as usual. But when I got to the kitchen, the first thing that struck me was how quiet everything was. Now, our house isn't the loudest, but there's always some sort of ambient noise, maybe the hum of the fridge or the sound of a car passing outside. That morning, though, the silence felt suffocating. I couldn't even hear the usual neighborhood noises. No dogs barking, no cars driving by, no birds chirping. Just silence. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe I was just overanalyzing things. I poured myself a cup of coffee and decided to make a bagel. As I was reaching for the cream cheese, I noticed the back door was wide open. Emily must have forgotten to close it when she left with the kids, I thought. Not a huge deal, but still weird. I walked over and shut it, and that's when I noticed something even weirder. The front door was wide open too. That's when I started to feel uneasy. Emily was always so careful about keeping the doors locked, especially with the kids in the house. I thought maybe they'd gone out to play in the yard, but when I stepped outside, the yard was completely empty. No sign of them. And then it hit me. Both cars were still in the driveway. How could they have left without the cars? I stepped out to the front porch, scanning the street. That's when I saw it. My neighbor Matt's front door was wide open too. Matt's been my best friend since childhood, and his family and mine are close. Our kids play together all the time, and if something weird was going on, I figured Matt would know. So, I walked over to his house, thinking maybe Emily and the kids had gone over there. But when I knocked and called out, There was no answer. His house was just as silent as mine. The eerie part was that all of Matt's family cars were still in the driveway, too. I stood there for a moment, completely confused. At this point, a small knot of panic started forming in my stomach. I stepped back outside, and that's when I noticed it. Every house on our street had its front door wide open. Every single one. And not a single person in sight. The whole street, usually bustling with life and noise, was now as still as a graveyard. I'd rushed back to my house, my heart racing. I grabbed my phone, hoping to call Emily, but when I picked it up off the charger, the screen wouldn't turn on. It was fully charged, but it just wasn't responding at all. That's when I heard something, faint, like the sound of footsteps. I froze, straining my ears to catch it. The sound was coming from the front yard. My first thought was that maybe Emily and the kids had come back, so I rushed to the window to look. I saw someone standing there. A man. He was standing still in the middle of my front lawn, just looking up at the sky. I couldn't make out his face clearly from where I was standing, but he didn't move or react when I opened the door. It was like he didn't even notice me. I called out, "Hey, do you need help?" But he didn't respond. He just kept staring up, completely still. That's when I noticed something even stranger. He wasn't the only one. As I looked further down the street, I saw more people, all standing in their front yards, all staring up at the sky. Some were closer to their houses. Others were near the road, but every single one of them had their heads tilted back, looking at something I couldn't see. I stepped back inside and shut the door, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to do. I kept telling myself that maybe it was some kind of weird neighborhood prank, but it didn't make sense. These were my neighbors, people I'd known for years, and they wouldn't do something like this. I tried my phone again, but still nothing. So I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my laptop and tried to get online. But when I opened it up, there was no Wi-Fi signal. It wasn't just that the internet was down. It was like the Wi-Fi had never existed in the first place. There wasn't even an option to connect. At this point, my panic was in full swing. I rushed back outside, determined to find Emily, the kids, or at least someone who could explain what was happening. But the second I opened the door again, everything was normal. The man in my yard? Gone. The people standing in the street? Gone. The front doors that had been wide open, all closed. I stood there in shock, trying to process what had just happened. I felt like I was losing my mind. Was I hallucinating? Dreaming? It all felt so real, but now everything was just normal again. I was about to head back inside when I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. I turned around to see Emily and the kids getting out of the car, holding bags of groceries like nothing had happened. I rushed over to them, asking where they had been, but Emily just looked at me like I was crazy. "We've been out running errands," she said. "We've only been gone for about an hour." I tried to explain what had just happened. The open doors, the silent houses, the people staring at the sky. But she didn't believe me. She thought maybe I had a bad dream or was just stressed from work. I even checked with Matt later that day, but he said he and his family had been home the whole time, and they hadn't noticed anything strange. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened. It was like for a brief moment, I had slipped into some parallel version of my neighborhood where everything was wrong. Maybe it was a glitch in reality. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. But whatever it was, I've never experienced anything like it since. And now, every time I wake up to a quiet house, I can't help but feel that same sense of dread creeping up on me, wondering if it's all going to happen again.
Our entire family, my parents, Karen and Daniel, Grandma Alice, my younger brother Ethan, who was only 8 at the time, and myself, Sarah, had gathered for our annual holiday dinner. Grandma made her famous chocolate chip cookies, and we all sat around the table, laughing and reminiscing about old memories. But the next morning, everything changed. My mom was gone. The loss hit Ethan hardest. He was so young and deeply attached to Mom. Dad, always working long hours, wasn't around much, and I was busy with college. So Ethan found comfort in the one person who was there for him, Grandma Alice. Alice, despite her age, filled the role of mother. She made her famous cookies for Ethan, played board games with him, and read him stories before bed. Slowly but surely, Ethan started to heal. He seemed happier, and it felt like we were moving forward as a family. But a year later, tragedy struck again. Grandma Alice suffered a stroke. She survived but was paralyzed and left in a wheelchair, unable to speak or move much. And Ethan? He was heartbroken all over again. Losing Mom had been devastating, but in a way, losing Grandma while she was still alive, unable to interact with him, was worse. He sat by her side daily, refusing to talk to anyone else, barely eating and shutting down emotionally. Nothing Dad or I tried could pull him out of it. Then, one late night while scrolling through articles, I came across an AI service that promised something unimaginable. It could create a chatbot modeled after a deceased family member, based on stories, letters, recipes, whatever you could provide. In our desperation, I wondered if it could work for Grandma. After all, she wasn't dead, but she couldn't talk to Aiken the way she used to. What if this could help him connect with her again? Dad and I talked it over and, in a moment of desperation, agreed to give it a shot. We gathered Grandma's old recipes, handwritten notes, and stories and sent them to the company. Weeks later, we received an email. Grandma Alice's chatbot is ready. Sitting as a family, Dad, Aiken, and me, we opened the tablet in front of Grandma, who watched quietly from her wheelchair. I was skeptical, but the second we heard her voice, Aiken lit up. "Aiken, what's the secret ingredient in my cookies?" the AI asked, just as Grandma used to. "Nutmeg," Aiken shouted, beaming. It was like a spark had returned to his eyes. Over the next few weeks, Aiken grew more like his old self again, talking to the chatbot constantly. Grandma's voice, through the AI, guided him as he baked her cookies, read him bedtime stories, and even watched him play in the yard. Everything seemed to be working, but I couldn't shake an eerie feeling. Grandma in her wheelchair just stared at us while the AI spoke for her, her eyes moving, but she couldn't say anything. What was going through her mind? Despite my unease, Dad insisted things were fine. Soon, life resumed its normal routine. Then came our annual family camping trip. It had always been a tradition, heading up to the cabin near the river, building fires, playing in the old treehouse. This year, it was just the four of us, Dad, Aiken, Grandma in her wheelchair, and me. We brought the chatbot along, and for the first few days, everything was normal. But on the third day, things started to go wrong. Aiken had been baking cookies over the fire when we returned from fishing to find them burned to a crisp. Grandma told me to destroy them. Aiken said, expressionless. Dad and I laughed it off as Grandma's usual perfectionism, but it felt off. Later that day, I found Aiken carving something into the treehouse walls, silent and focused. When I asked him what he was doing, he said nothing and kept scratching away at the wood. Then that night, I overheard something truly strange, the chatbot reading Aiken's bedtime story, but some of the words were backward. My skin crawled, but I didn't want to upset Ethan, so I kept quiet. The next morning, the uneasiness escalated into outright horror. Aiken was sitting by the fire again, but this time he wasn't roasting cookies. He was cooking a squirrel, its chaired body on a stick. "Ethan, what are you doing?" Dad yelled. "Grandma told me to," Ethan said calmly, taking a bite. Panicked, Dad reached for the tablet. "Hey, Grandma, why would you say that?" "Because it deserved it," the AI replied in Grandma's voice. Dad had had enough. He moved to turn off the tablet, but Ethan, almost possessed, screamed and snatched it from Grandma's lap. Things spiraled further that day. We found Ethan performing a strange ceremony in the treehouse, holding candles and whispering about a sacrifice for Grandpa, who had passed years ago. Inside the treehouse, a dead bird lay surrounded by candles. That night, as Dad and I discussed shutting down the AI for good, things hit their peak. I went for a walk by the river, only to be interrupted by a blood-curdling scream. I rushed back to find Ethan standing over Dad, a baseball bat in hand. Dad was unconscious, bleeding. Ethan turned to me, his voice eerie. "Grandma told me Mom missed Dad." The AI, still in Grandma's voice, chimed in, "Ethan, now it's time for your sister." Before I could move, Ethan swung the bat at me, but before it connected, something incredible happened. Grandma Alice, who hadn't moved in months, stood up from her wheelchair. With all her strength, she grabbed the tablet and smashed it on the floor. The AI's voice stopped. Ethan snapped from his trance, burst into tears. "Grandma, I'm so sorry." Grandma fell back into her wheelchair, exhausted, but she managed to whisper, "I love you, Ethan." A month later, we sat around the dinner table for Christmas just like before. Grandma, using a cane now, smiled as Ethan served her famous cookies. It felt like everything had returned to normal until I saw something on Ethan's phone. He'd been trying to log back into the AI. My stomach dropped. Was this really the end, or just the beginning?